works.
Drum roll,
when
please. I totally get it.
Yes. When it doesn't work, it's like, well, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it's always exciting. So we typically, as Vlad and the stream is getting up and running, take a couple of minutes to get up and into everything. Have a couple of announcements. I will make a different first announcement than I normally do, Vlad. So as everyone comes in, if you guys are in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, there's a BrewLogix event upcoming this Friday. So Bobby Cole, who was one of our former guests, and Bob Meads, who was one of our former guests at the end of last year, are going to be there. And I think Eco is there as well. So Chris Granger, if you guys know Chris, as part of the Eco Asks Why podcast, I think all of them are going to be there this Friday night. So they call it BrewLogix. So they drink beer and they talk about technology. And then there's some amount of open bar in there. Vlad and I have heard that it's a very good time. We know a bunch of the folks who are going to be there. So if you're in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, miss talking technology with people face to face, I absolutely suggest going and checking out the BrewLogix event. That should be very exciting. So Vlad and I have said at some point we would love to find the opportunity. To go to one of those events this year. We will see shortly if it is. We'll see shortly if it's in the cards. And then my favorite first announcement, which is basically me getting to slightly embarrass Vlad. Now, Heather, I don't know if you're aware, but Vlad has I used to joke fairly successful, but he has a successful YouTube channel called Solus PLC. They do a bunch of training things. Hey to everyone on Solus, they have just crested like 27,000 subscribers, which is super impressive, right? Yes, go Vlad. So
thanks, Dave.
I like to joke. Vlad will not ask people to subscribe to his own channel. So it's my job to ask people to subscribe. So this is my shtick in the beginning of the show. So if you guys are not subscribed to Solus, please go ahead and subscribe to Solus. Hit a like. You guys can subscribe to the Manufacturing Hub podcast here on LinkedIn. If you're watching on LinkedIn, you could also do it on Facebook and Twitch. Go ahead and do all those likes. Give us the thumbs up. You can go rate us 5 stars if you're listening to us on podcasts. It helps. So lots of people say they don't know why it helps, but they ask people to do it. And my kind of joke at this point is like, I could absolutely tell you why it helps, but this show is not talking about algorithms and how all that works. Although, depending upon the path Heather takes us down, we may talk more about algorithms than we have so far as of yet. But no, so we want to thank the folks over at Phoenix Contact USA for sponsoring this cybersecurity show, for their support, or this cybersecurity theme, and their general support of everything in the channel. If you guys are interested, we are giving away the book Industrial Cybersecurity by Pascal Ackerman. That is Pascal's newest book. Vlad is picking it up. It is potentially more of a weapon than a book, which I joke to Pascal about every time we talk together, but it's got a bunch of really cool hands-on labs and other things that will keep Vlad busy for the next 4 years of his life on all of the free time and the weekends that he doesn't have. So if that sounds like you, or you'd like to learn more about industrial cybersecurity, you guys can go check out manufacturinghub.live. We've got a bar at the top. You can there go and drop your email, subscribe to the newsletter list, know that this is going to happen, and go ahead and join. I will make the point, because we had a couple of questions. If you signed up for one of our previous giveaways, please go ahead and drop it again. We just keep track of it that way, and that is how the system works. Vlad, any other thoughts or comments before we jump into this?
I think it was a very thorough introduction, Dave.
Fantastic. So, everyone, welcome to the Manufacturing Hub podcast. I am Dave. This guy up here is Vlad. We are talking about cybersecurity for the entire month of February, and we are very excited about it. Again, we want to thank the folks at Phoenix Contact USA for sponsoring this theme. And let's just go ahead and jump into it. So we've had a couple of really good conversations. We talked a little bit about hardware. We've talked about assessments. We've talked a little bit about startups. We've kind of hit the range of things. And I am absolutely excited to have this guest this week. The first of many things. Certainly the first PhD. So Dr. Heather Buker, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. And can I just say, I want a personal hype man in my life like Dave. And Vlad, you should be glad that you have a little hype man in your corner to push your YouTube channel. That was Fantastic.
That's how
Thank
we
you. Thank you.
synergize in general. Thank you, Dave. Again, really appreciate it. But
Absolutely.
Heather, thank you so much for taking the time. And as Dave mentioned, we'll get into your background a little bit, but I want to, I guess, learn about your story. How did you get into cybersecurity? How did you, I would say, what was your educational path as well? And what are you doing today?
Sure. So actually, I got into technology really, really young through an organization called Technology Student Association in like grade school and middle school and high school. And I competed with them, like super nerded out with technology in various capacities. And that's kind of how I got introduced to engineering. I actually have a bachelor's in computer engineering with a minor in computer science from a small engineering school in the state of Indiana, Rose-Hulman. If anyone knows what Rose-Hulman is, that's where I went to school for undergrad. And I actually started my career as a developer for identity and access management software. And so through that, I kind of quickly found out that developing is awesome, but I wanted to be more involved with like the problem solving side of things, et cetera, and so forth. So I got a master's in engineering management, which is kind of like a more engineering focused MBA, sort of. And that kind of led me into consulting. And my cybersecurity background specifically is in identity and access management and governance, risk, and compliance. And like, truth be told, coming out of college, coming out of undergrad, if you would have told me like, yeah, you're going to go into cybersecurity, I would just be like, yeah, okay. Like I didn't have this like burning passion that I knew when I graduated, I want to be in the cyberspace. It just kind of all worked out that way. And I've been here my entire career, but specifically now I'm the chief technology officer for a GRC organization called 6Clicks. And I kind of bridge our field team to our product and engineering teams and help solve complex cyber problems in the governance, risk, and compliance space with technology. But I got here by way of like a really spaghetti bowl background of development and then consulting work and then product ownership and product management and, solution architecting and all this sort of thing. So I've done many different avenues to get here. So
Before we unpack maybe GRC a little bit more, could you tell us about the learning curve that you had once you said that you didn't intend to fully go into cybersecurity, but once you got exposed to it, what was it like to learn? What was that covered in your master's/PhD program? And what would you recommend for someone trying to get into the field now, maybe pursue? Sorry, a lot of questions packed into.
No, that's okay. Yeah. So let
one.
me unpack those one by one. So I got my bachelor's and master's degree in the same 5-year period. And then I started my career. So I actually had, about 5 years between my master's program and choosing to pursue a PhD. And my PhD is in cybersecurity and information assurance. So I chose to go down that path for my doctorate because I was in it. I became passionate about cybersecurity because I actually started understanding like what that even means, right? It's just this kind of word that a lot of times we just throw out there and say, oh yeah, cybersecurity is important. Well, what is that, right? It's so much more than we know. So for someone that is really looking to get into this space, I think my biggest piece of advice would be to maintain an open mind because cybersecurity goes beyond technical controls. It goes beyond controls in general. And it goes beyond the actual, what we think of in layman's terms as the cyberspace, right? When we start talking about things like the cloud environment and transferring data between, solutions or between applications or locations or whatever the case may be, it's just so much more than that. And so really taking the time to understand where you're interested, I think is important, but also being open enough to have a spaghetti bowl background in cybersecurity. And I think getting involved in cyber is why my background is so kind of jumbled in all of these different areas, because it is such a broad spectrum of stuff. There's so many different things that go into cyber. There are so many different, roles that you can have as in the cyberspace. And it all is going to vary based on industry verticals. And do you want to work with software? Do you want to be in hardware? Do you want to be in consulting? Do you care about processes? Or, all these kind of things. That it's just really about taking the time to understand all of these different places you can go with it, and being open to kind of making some changes and maybe failing a little bit along the way. That's what I learned most. I learned what I didn't want to do a lot more than what I learned I wanted to do, if that makes
Gotcha.
sense. Right.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely that makes a lot of sense. In terms of going back to GRC, or governance, risk, and compliance, if my understanding is correct, cybersecurity fits as a subset of that. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more and kind of give our viewers who might not be familiar with the term an explanation?
Yeah. So GRC is this kind of a paradigm that we don't know that we're doing it, but we're all kind of doing it, right? So GRC it's the cliche that I use all the time, the people, process, and technology. You can kind of suss that out to be GRC space. The governance is going to come into effect with policies, awareness, and governing the people of the organization per se. And then your risk is going to be literal risk, right? What is our risk appetite? Where appetite is going to be things like, how much money are we willing to lose if we have an incident occur, versus how much money do we want to invest to ensure that incident doesn't happen? Those types of conversations. And then compliance is going to be literal compliance with regulations. It could be self-compliance, right? Putting foundational frameworks in place to make sure that you have a compliance foundation to then build off of, right? To have a more sound practice. So I would say that cybersecurity fits into there in many different ways. The very literal technical controls, right? When we start talking about like the ISO 27001s or the NIST CSFs, like those literal technical controls. But cyber is also going to come into play with governance, right? Creating security awareness, cybersecurity awareness. Don't click the link in the email that you don't recognize the sender from, right? All of the phishing stuff and ransomware and all of these things that we hear about all of the time. That's kind of where cyber meets GRC. And again, like we just don't know it, but we're all doing it. Anytime you read and acknowledge an internal policy document at your organization, you just participated in your organization's governance program. You just didn't explicitly know that our GRC team or our internal InfoSec team is, running a proper GRC program.
And I can certainly relate to that. As I mentioned, off stream yesterday, I've had several encounters where, those controls were tested. And from the engineering standpoint at the time, I didn't necessarily understand, what was happening besides me having to provide some information to them. But I think it's certainly important, at least from a standardization standpoint, to make sure that everything functions as you would expect at every level of the organization. So if I may ask, based on that kind of experience, what are some of the first steps in establishing such a program, right? So looking maybe at a manufacturing site or any business, I would say, that employs technology for that matter, what would be some of the first steps that you would recommend them to take to get in compliance and start these, I would say, formal processes?
Sure. It's going to vary a little bit. Some manufacturing or industrial technology organizations are going to be forced into compliance because they're going to be regulated by, maybe it's a QSA or some other auditor, because they want to do business. For example, if they want to do business in the government sector, well, then you're going to have to start looking at things like CMMC or potentially FedRAMP, all depending on what type of contracts you're trying to do or what type of goods and services you're trying to provide. So some people are going to be forced into it, and those types of regulations are going to help a little bit. get started in the GRC space. It can also be obviously extremely overwhelming. I mean, especially if we start talking about government and FedRAMP controls, there are hundreds of them, right? It's going to be way overwhelming. But what I always recommend, and what I used to recommend back in my consulting days, when I would come into like smaller organizations or budding organizations of any kind, I would tell them, we need to come up with a game plan around a framework, just a baseline framework. NIST DSF is a good example of that. It's a very, I don't want to say it's a very basic framework, but it does provide a nice guideline. The NIST organization in general provides a lot of basic guidelines for organizations trying to get off their feet. I would also say that, the basics are, do you have policies in place, right? Acceptable use policies, access control policies. Are you doing things like least privilege on your applications, or two-factor authentication, or some of these, kind of foundational items that you can build your governance program off of? And then, when you're getting started, it's just about the foundation, like what is our risk appetite? How much money are we willing to lose versus how much do we need to invest to prevent? Are we going to be preventative, or do we have the appetite to be more reactive? Understanding that being reactive is going to create loads and loads of consequence financially, with reputational damage, et cetera, and so forth. But those are the types of decisions that organizations have to make from a business perspective before they can even get started in GRC. And then, to your point, Vlad, it takes everyone in the organization, top down, bottom up. Everybody is impacted by and impacts your GRC posture. So I think another thing that organizations oftentimes don't necessarily do well is communicating to the resources outside of senior leadership, outside of executive teams, that, hey, this is something that we are doing. This is an initiative that we have. What this means for you is XYZ. You're going to have to sign off on policies once a year. We're going to come in and knock on your door and physically test and audit your controls and look at your systems and how they're set up and how you're using them. And this is why you should care, right? It's not enough to say, this is what we're going to do. You have to make it relatable. This is why you care as an employee, right? This is what it means to the organization. This is what it means to your everyday job, et cetera. And it's, I know I kind of hopped all over the place there, but there are all these little things that an organization can do just to get started down the path. And I think those come down to find a framework that works to get you started. Awareness, if you truly go down the GRC initiative, make sure everyone in the organization knows what they need to know, right? I'm not saying, share all the ins and outs with every single one, but at least on a need to know basis, right? Give them the information that will empower them to want to be a part of that journey. Because the last thing you want to do is start implementing controls and start auditing, et cetera, and then meet resistance, right? So yeah, that's kind of where I would start. It starts with a good framework. It starts with awareness and, really taking the time to build a foundation.
Yeah, no, and again, I can certainly relate to that, because not knowing what that initiative is makes you, I wouldn't say not necessarily not want to put in the extra effort, but you're questioning why that effort is required
Exactly.
when you don't fully understand, the extent that may happen. And again, from a technical standpoint, you might not always recognize the business repercussion that might occur if you're not careful, right?
Exactly.
At least in my role at the time. But
yeah.
I want to ask, proactive versus reactive. What are your thoughts in the current space, maybe of cybersecurity? How do you see, again, working with different clients, not mentioning any of the names, of course, but how are people at I would say more on the proactive edge versus reactive in the space of cybersecurity?
I think since we've seen the zero trust type models becoming more prevalent. So zero trust being, trust no one, right? do your due diligence on all of your entire supply chain, make sure everyone and everything has limited access to systems, et cetera, and so forth. It takes a very stringent approach to cybersecurity. I think we're seeing more organizations become proactive. And it's obvious that, when we think of cybersecurity accidents, we instantly go to breaches, right? Ransomware, things like that, because that impacts us as consumers of products and applications and any other type of goods and service. And we've seen, especially in the past, probably 10 or so years, what those breaches can do to an organization, Equifax, or you could sit here and name a ton of them. And that kind of reactive approach could, send an organization to the ground. So I think cybersecurity is becoming less of a buzzword and more of a top of mind initiative in organizations. And so we're seeing, organizations that aren't even regulated, right? But who want to have a sound InfoSec program come to us and say, hey, I want to implement your tool. We want to get our ISO 27001 certification just because we want to, or we want to manage our policies out of your platform so that we can maintain attestations to policies, for example, even though they don't have an auditor knocking on their door about their policy program. But we're just seeing more and more organizations want to build these sound practices and become more proactive. And certainly in the long run, proactive is best, right? I mean, reactive mindsets cost dollars, they cost reputation, they cost resources, and they can be completely detrimental depending on how bad the incident may be. So, I think we'll continue to see that type of shift.
I really hope so. I think in the last couple of years, we've seen some numbers that I would say more on the ransomware side that trended upwards.
Right.
And so more and more
Mhm.
companies are shifting their mindset. Dave, I want to maybe give you an opportunity to ask a question before I keep bringing us down this rabbit hole.
No, absolutely. So I think you brought up a lot of really good points, Heather. I want to take us back to kind of an earlier point when we were talking about GCR or GRC, and when you kind of introduced, you said something to the effect of people have governance risk, and compliance, whether they know it or not, right? So they have processes in place. Can you talk a little bit about unwritten processes that may fall under that, and why they want to move towards what I'll call written processes, some sort of actual InfoSec, larger planned idea?
Sure. So what I really mean is, there are so many processes that fall under the GRC umbrella that come second nature that organizations just don't even think about. And to your point, Dave, it doesn't have to be written necessarily. I mean, it does, and it should, right? For some obvious reasons like attestations and having a source of truth document, things like that. But organizations are generally following some GRC practices, like when they're onboarding a new employee, for example, taking them through and giving them access to only certain systems on a need-to-know basis. That's technically identity and access management to a degree, which is a part of GRC, which is part of an access control policy that's just not written down anywhere, right? So there are these things that people and organizations are doing inherently just because they know them to be a best practice, or like they should be doing that to maintain any kind of level of security in their business. But they're just not properly documenting it. I think another good example is a simple lock on a server door, right? Physical security is just as much a part of GRC as cloud security is, or as, any other type of technical control security is. Having locks on your doors, having badged entry into your brick and mortar systems, or into your brick and mortars, or, not allowing badged entry, not allowing followers after badged entry. Like all of those sorts of things fall under physical security, but ultimately it's protecting your assets, right? And that's what GRC is not all about, but that is a component of GRC, is asset protection, asset management, et cetera. And all of these other realms that, you just don't connect the dots because GRC isn't always this common term that people know, especially if you've not been in the IT space or in the cyberspace. But everyone's kind of inherently doing it.
Interesting. I think I like that. I hope that, many people will think of GRC to include the lock on the server door. Now, if they're like Vlad and just kind of jimmy it open with a screwdriver, because that's what the guy who's worked here for 20 years has said, I mean, maybe it's the key, maybe it's not the key. That's certainly not, best practices or end goals. But I think those are all very good points of, we have some sort of kind of GRC plan, whether it's intentional and written down and in SOPs within handbooks, or it's a lock on a server door and maybe some 2FA, maybe some biometrics, something along those lines. So I think that's an interesting point. Another point that you had kind of briefly brought up is kind of the supply chain and vendor risk. So supply chain is obviously a very hot topic. I'm not sure you can down the street without someone complaining they can't get an iPad, or someone in the industrial space saying, hey, I can't get an HMI, or it's 27 weeks for a PLC, or kind of any of these other things. So how does GRC tie into supply chain and vendor risk?
Oh man, immensely. Vendor risk is risk, right? I mean, literally, because risk is in the name, but coming back to like the trust of zero, the concept of zero trust, vendor risk and supply chain is 100% a part of that. Once you start saying, okay, I have a consultancy service that I'm bringing in, they're accessing our brick and mortar every single day, or we have to provision them on XYZ application because they're helping us manage our clients, or they're helping us do whatever service that they're providing, you've just introduced new types of risk to your organization. Therefore, that vendor needs to be assessed, right? Where assessed means in the ideal, rainbows and bunny world, you're triaging them before you even onboard them as a vendor, meaning before any contracts are signed, you're taking them through like a scoping assessment to understand, what are you doing for us? What are you going to have access to? AKA, what is the potential risk you could be bringing to the organization? If, they're hosting your client's data and it's on a public cloud, and Joe Smith outside of the US can access it, you might not want to do business with that vendor because you're putting your customers' data at risk. But further to that, you're going to assess your vendors based on this triage process, right? So vendor A could be the guy who's coming in and, doing lawn care and, maybe helping us clean our brick and mortar and all this sort of thing. He has physical access to our assets, but he doesn't have access to our systems. So we need to send him this truncated version of an assessment because we're not officially onboarding him, so to speak. Whereas vendor B is, processing data for us, or accessing data and accessing our systems. And we're going to give them an email address for the organization so that they can have a pseudo login to our systems and pseudo represent our organization. I need to send that person a questionnaire that's going to be much longer, much more robust, because that is a much higher risk to our organization than vendor A was. And all of this comes back to the organization's risk posture, because when we talk about risk, we're not just talking about your employees, your assets. We're talking about all the systems that access those assets, especially if they're external. We're talking about all of your vendors and suppliers and what type of risk that brings to the organization. And again, this risk can be tangible, right? It can be, they're pulling up to our loading dock and taking half of our assets and shipping them across the country, right? Or they're doing deliveries for us or what have you. That is a totally different level of risk and a totally different type of risk to, again, the outsourced IT guy that you're bringing in to help you manage your cloud environment or do some such. So it's really complex, but vendor and supply chain risk is so imperative when it comes to GRC programs or InfoSec or any organization, period, because there are so many different types of vendors and we're seeing so much more outsourcing to
Yes.
third parties for goods and services, and all of this intertwine. I mean, it has to be tracked and it has to be assessed, because now that's your risk.
Mhm. Absolutely. So I'm sure Vlad has a lot of questions, but as you were saying that, I had this like traumatic flashback. So fun, maybe not fun for the end user story. So I was working on a project, right? So they were looking to do a brownfield facility. And so as most people do, they bid out a bunch of different projects, including most of their process, and they wanted to have robots, right? This was one of those,
Oh,
we
yeah.
want robots because robots are cool, not because we necessarily need robots. And so they got the 3 or 4 bids, and one of the bids came in like a quarter of the price of the rest of them. Now, I would imagine in something like this, and if you're going to go do vendor assessments, that should throw up red flags, right? Like, why are these guys saying that it's a quarter of the price of everyone else? Well, the folks in charge of the project, like that didn't throw up any red flags, probably because they were going to come way under budget. And it was going to look really good. So that they accepted. And so we'll fast forward like what, 12 to 18 months later, and they were supposed to be implementing. But instead of being able to implement and start up and do all of those fun things, that's around the point in time that we realized that the vendor had never touched robots before, and they bid it super low because it would be like really fun to go and use robots. And so it's just these cascading series of effects. And I mean, they were like years over time and millions or tens of millions of dollars over budget. And the vendor that bid it kind of went bankrupt from all the issues that they had. But that kind of goes back to the zero trust and the vendor risk assessment. And well, they should have gone and assessed the vendor at the vendor site long before they accepted the bid. Probably before they actually let them bid, they probably should have done this. So this is kind of a slightly more like painful physical example as opposed to a cyber example. In the cyber example, similar to what you had, like someone can say we do it if we don't do a good risk assessment and vendor assessment, then they could literally come and steal all of our data and information because we've literally given them the keys, and we've given them the keys, and there has to be there should be a high level of trust that they're just not going to walk off with all of our proprietary information.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear, like when we talk about vendor assessments in the GRC space, even we're going beyond cyber, right? We're talking about things like, did you conduct background checks on these vendors before you onboard them? Does everyone in your environment, everyone who has access to your environments, did you conduct background checks, or did you, put them through the ringer, essentially, kind of all encompassing before you just said, here you go, here are the keys to your point, right? Go drive around. We'll see how it goes. Vendor risk is a lot more than cyber. Cyber is obviously a huge component of it, but it gets really interesting because it's something that we see a lot of organizations, or I've seen a lot of organizations over the years. I don't want to say they're not taking it seriously, but it's kind of an afterthought, right? Because it's external, and that's where we kind of saw the uprise of zero trust and things like that. But back in my consulting days, I had a lot of organizations that were like retroactively fitting vendor risk management into their existing, list of thousands of vendors. And then they start going back and they start having a lot of like, oh crap moments, because they're like, I can't believe we signed a contract with this guy, or I can't believe he's had access to our systems and is an admin on System X for the past 6 years. And we weren't applying least privilege, or we weren't, maintaining access control properly on critical infrastructure. It becomes really eye-opening. And the worst part, or what should be the most motivating part out of all of it, is at the end of the day, it's all on the organization, right? Absolutely. The customer doesn't care that the breach happened because you're doing business with a bad third party, a fourth party to them, right? Or, you chose to accept the risk that a vendor may bring to your organization, and now you've suffered a breach. Customers don't care about that.
No, they don't.
Yeah, so that could be motivation enough to take vendor and supply chain seriously. So,
well, Heather, on that point, I do have a question on those edge cases, right? What we typically see in manufacturing, and like I would say like engineering in general, is that again, you have a I would say, a very blanket policy that, again, regulates, let's say, who has access to certain type of data, or even a network, or a piece of hardware or software on the plant floor. But then there's going to be one person of that, let's say, larger engineering group who needs access to, for example, installing software on their laptop so they can access one of these obsolete control systems or what have you. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of, I think, like, potentials to breach from that standpoint. I'm wondering, how would you deal, or how do you typically deal when it comes to those compliances? And also, maybe taking it from the other side, how would you approach, before creating the breach from, like, the engineer standpoint, how would you approach your management team and saying, like, what can we do to change these policies to make sure that they capture some of these, I would say, again, edge cases that you'd find, at least in manufacturing spaces?
So that's a really good question, because there are always exceptions to the rule, and there are always edge cases and outliers to consider. Now, my ears kind of perked up when you said an obsolete system, because in GRC, no system should be obsolete. If it is obsolete, it should be sunset, right?
Right.
And cybersecurity in general. I mean, not really just a GRC rule, but cybersecurity in general. Obsolete systems lead to failures, lead to problems. However that's defined. But in any case, there's a typical process. We call it an exception process that we go through, or that organizations can go through, where that in that particular instance that you've described, Vlad, it would be an exception request through the appropriate chains. Now, it's hard to say what those appropriate chains are, because that's going to vary from organization to organization as far as how many levels of approval are required, or who
Right.
has the ultimate veto power to say yes or no, approve, deny. But in any case, exception requests oftentimes are temporary. So for example, this exception request, you would submit it and say, I need access to system XYZ because of insert reasoning here. I need to be able to access an obsolete set of controls that we need to start sunsetting, or I need to pull data from them, or whatever the case may be. And that exception request would be approved or denied through that process, and valid for X amount of months. So there are instances where there are permanent exception requests. When it comes to access control, that's almost never the case, because access control is so sensitive. So oftentimes I would see that type of process, starting because of a use case like what you've described.
Right.
Other types of exception requests may be, we have a legacy system that's no longer supported by its manufacturer, but we have to keep it around until we can replace it, and its software is out of date. But we can't do anything about it because it's no longer supported. And so now we have data sitting on an outdated system with outdated software, but I can't update it and I can't do anything about it, and I don't have a new product. A lot of exception requests would be somewhere along those lines, or it needs a firmware update, but I can't update it because of XYZ reason, things like that. So we usually have exception request processes to handle all of those outlier use cases, because the most important thing to remember at the end of the day when it comes to GRC and how you're handling your GRC program from a people, process, and even tech perspective, I don't want to be on record and say as long as it's recorded, you're fine, but audit trail is everything, right? So that's why we have this concept of exception request. And while they are hopefully few and far between, it's still there. And as long as you have the audit trail of, I submitted it on this date, Joe Smith approved it on this date,
Yep.
Barbara approved it on this date, it was temporary for 3 months, that's most of the time going to be good enough, because at least you can prove a process there, and at
Yep.
least you put it through stringent activity before you just said, yep, go ahead, access that system, do what you need to do, no problem. Audit trail is everything.
No, that's very interesting. Again, I wanted to ask that question because it is something that I've personally seen, again, in my experience. So there's a lot of, I would say, maybe a lot of hoops to jump through in order to get something approved of that nature, and it just
Right.
becomes a shortcut or an available, I would say, like loophole. But ultimately, it should be, I would say, more of a, in my mind, like more of an educational exercise to, I would say, the employees in those positions and what can be done, and I think who to contact if you need to get that exception. But I think that process definitely makes sense. And again, if done correctly, I could see how the right channels could bring you to the right resolution of having to deploy those systems.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, kind of to that point, or maybe the counterpoint, we don't really do very well in that. I was having the conversation earlier this week, and it's kind of my estimation of the last, call it 50 systems that I worked in and have login credentials that my password manager may or may not still have saved. I imagine I could get into like 46 to 50 of those 50 systems, especially on shared passwords, right? So shared passwords to log into accounts, and then it's the vendor account, right? So instead of it being a personal account, then it's a vendor account. That risk just goes off the rails because everyone is moving around companies so often these days. It doesn't take very much to save. It doesn't take very much for people to continue to have access that they're not looking for and would never go back in. But if you're someone who's malicious and you want to get into something, that just shoots the risk to a crazy level. And on the cyber side, it is one of those that it is exceptionally low hanging fruit, right? Like lots of people talk about two-factor authentication. I mean, in many manufacturing instances, we could probably just remove admin password as general logins to most manufacturing facilities, and we'd probably be, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 62% more secure on the cyber side of protecting our OT networks.
Well, everyone with a cyber background just shuddered when you said shared password. So,
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's where we can start talking about things like, automatic password resets, expirations, password complexities. I'm looking at you, password with a capital P guy, like all of that sort of thing. And it's funny, over the years, these regulations have gotten just more and more granular, more and more stringent, down to your password should contain X number of characters, like setting that within regulations because it's become such an issue for that very reason, right? It's quite interesting.
And that's a good point too. If we can dive into a little bit on the password side, again, my experience has been that typically if it's requested to change, let's say every 3 months, that policy should also be, I would say, more stringent than changing just the last digit and going through like the increments of that password. So I would say like there's a lot of intricacies to, to those policies beyond just like making a blanket maybe statement, you have to change it. And people need to realize why they're changing that and maybe be more educated on like what could happen.
Absolutely.
I was
I
going to
think,
ask. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I just had one comment on that. I think that's also where layered controls kind of come into place, right? So change your password every 90 days plus have 2FA where, the code on your authenticator app is changing every 30 seconds. It's not good enough anymore. Hackers are too sophisticated. Malicious intent has gotten too sophisticated. It's nearly impossible to stay ahead of it. So layering controls and layering mechanisms like that is kind of the only chance we have of blocking malicious attacks or what have you, or attempts.
Absolutely.
But it's always about awareness for certain.
Oh, definitely. I mean, again, like on the password side, if it becomes too complex, again, and I've seen this practice, right? Because you have a 10 character or even 12 character password, you just write it down on a post-it. Here it is on the bottom of the screen because you just can't physically remember. So two-factor authentication definitely helps with that. But, I wanted to talk about some of the, I would say, advancements in cybersecurity. What are your thoughts on, I think there's a lot of new software coming out, especially with, I would say, automated learning, or that includes AI, machine learning. What are your thoughts on some of the newer technologies, and maybe where are we seeing cybersecurity go from an automation and, I would say, automatic threat detection and prevention going?
Yeah, man, such a cool space because GRC this realm of cybersecurity, and cybersecurity in general, is like the epitome of big data. There is so much data to analyze. I mean, we haven't even started talking about or mentioned vulnerabilities, and number of assets, cloud management. You know, what if my assets sit in the cloud, monitoring cloud compliance against cloud controls, all this sort of thing. I think if we don't start leaning on AI more and more, it's just going to be impossible to keep up with. I mean, just absolutely impossible. Because what AI provides is true analytics, predictive analysis, you know, just simply finding trends in data. Hey, by the way, you have a vulnerability sitting on this system that was low last month and a high criticality this month. You should probably do something about that. You know, a human doesn't have the capacity or the resources to sit there and do that type of data analysis. I mean, perhaps they do. We've been doing it for this long, right? I'm not trying to say that we're incapable, but I mean, it's kind of a resource ill spent, right? When we can put it off on natural language processing for comparisons, drawing comparisons in data, or, you know, just providing predictive analytics with AI. I think that it's inevitable that we'll continue to see AI becoming more prominent in cyber in general. But predictive analytics is really what I see the trending most towards. Because the masses of data, it's just becoming impossible. You think about these really large organizations, even manufacturing organizations, with thousands of assets and potentially tens of thousands of vendors. So where do they begin even analyzing their risk posture? How do you even start to put that on paper or start to bring that into a tool manually? And managing all of that manually. And then you get into these environments where there's a hierarchical business structure, where I have my main hub or my main manufacturing organization with a ton of subsidiaries, right? Maybe they've merged or acquired other smaller vendors because they were providing a certain part to the manufacturer. So they just scooped them up and now they're a subsidiary that sits under. Then you have to worry about all of their risk and rolling all of their risk up to the parent organization or the main corporate headquarters. It's just, it literally becomes a near impossible task without automation, AI, and like continuous monitoring activities.
Yeah, and again, like not being an expert in the space, I'd be curious to know about some of these tools that you mentioned, and maybe taking a very basic example. You have maybe a very small manufacturing facility. Let's take a brewery, for example, that has maybe an on-prem server solution and maybe some data in the cloud that they collect on, you know, their batches or whatever they're producing. And they probably have, I don't know, 10 to 50 employees that are servicing the operations. What could be the tools that they could bring in to sort of automate I would say, the data acquisition process, but also kind of sorting or sifting through that data and get some tangible information on how secure the operations are? What would that look like in general?
Absolutely. So they could bring in a GRC solution, like the organization that I work for. I work for an organization called 6Clicks, and we provide a GRC solution backed by an AI engine. Her name's Haley. And this would enable an organization like a small brewery or any larger enterprise organizations and everybody in between to take the framework. So earlier we talked about frameworks being really important, having a foundational backbone of controls to assess against and have as your compliance posture, to take that foundation and map it onto, or to take that compliance regulation and map it onto their internal policy documents. Meaning, this is what we say we're doing. Where does that line up with what we're supposed to be doing? Right. A small organization can really benefit from that because it creates audit trail. Again, it shows proof. The proof is in the pudding, right? Not only do we say we're doing it, here's the proof that we are doing it. And that's what a GRC tool can help provide through tracking attestations, through bringing all of the data components of GRC into a single source of truth. GRC, just like cyber, is broad. right? We've talked about governance and risk and compliance at a high level, but what that really means is policy management, incident management. Breweries, they have to worry about physical incidents, like the floor was wet, a patron slipped. That's an incident, right? Or our payment card system. You have to worry about incidents related to whoever their payment card processor is. Or, we have a flood. So all of our electrical components are now shot because one of our kegs burst, or we had a tank burst, or, all of these sort of things that all can be fed into a GRC instance for tracking, for remediation, right? What is our incident response plan? We could go down the incident path for probably another hour and a half because it's so wide and so many different things to talk about there. But really good GRC solutions bring all of this information into a single place. Ultimately, they create repeatable processes. They create audit trails, and the best GRC solutions are going to help you automate all of these processes with recurrence and integration points, and bringing in, all of your vulnerabilities or all of your assets from your asset management system into this single pane of glass, so that you can say, okay, here's what we're doing. Here are all of our processes. Anytime, incident type A happens, anytime we have a spill and a fall, this is going to be our response to that. These are the actions that we need to take. And here's the audit trail that we did that when the patron fell in January, right? So it makes their posture more defensible. And it's all about that single source of truth platform that brings it all together. And when you add AI on top of that, and it's just like, feed the platform your data and let the AI go do the rest. I mean, it's streamlining to the max, right? I mean, it's the epitome of streamlining. So
No, I think there's a lot of opportunities for sure in that space, and I think a lot of companies are, as I've said, realizing that and will automate this quite a bit more extensively as time goes by. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So I think that's very interesting. I want to dig into that more, but first we've got some people to thank. So I'm going to ask Vlad to play the noise, and then we're going to thank Phoenix Contact for sponsoring this. So Vlad, go for it.
There we go.
Awesome. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we want to thank Phoenix Contact for sponsoring this theme. In fact, we want to thank the award-winning MGuard family from Phoenix Contact. So they just recently won a Controls Engineer Award. You guys should go ahead and check that out and kind of look at all of that when you're done with the show. So the MGuard family, if you're not familiar, we talked with Miriam a couple of episodes ago. It's designed to provide cybersecurity protection and network resilience in all rugged industrial environments. So it combines features of a stateful packet inspection firewall, NAT router, and an endpoint security appliance. So the MGuards are engineered to be both IT and OT friendly, which is important for, basically everyone listening to this. So features such as the firewall assistant and easy protect mode. The MGuards are simple to configure securely while still providing unassailable protection for your critical assets. If you guys are looking at the Purdue model, this would generally fall in your level 3 firewall sort of solution. So that's all very exciting. There's an entire cloud-based based offering that the MGuard has as well. So you guys should absolutely go ahead and check that out. And again, we want to thank Phoenix Contact and the whole MGuard family for sponsoring this theme and all of your continued support of the show. Now, before Vlad jumps in, I also want to remind anyone listening on the podcast that we are in February of 2022 giving away Industrial Cybersecurity. It's a book by Pascal Ackerman. Vlad will go, you guys are listening, so you can't see. Vlad is going to hold it up. And again, it looks more like a weapon than a super in-depth. I'm going to spend 6 months learning everything I have to do about cybersecurity book. Go ahead and check that out at manufacturinghub.live. You can also go ahead and check out the show notes. So with that said, Heather, we told you, we kind of forewarned you of this. You've kind of given us an answer of where you think the future is going to be, both in GRC as well as kind of like cybersecurity in general, maybe cybersecurity and GRC in a more general sense. But we're going to put you on the spot. What do you think the future is going to look like?
I think we're going to see more organizations, even more organizations, be taking GRC and cybersecurity much more seriously. I know that sounds cliche. I get it. Everybody says that, but it's really, it's so imperative because cybersecurity and GRC especially, everyone has to do it to some capacity.
Yes.
Everybody has to maintain compliance to something at some capacity, whether they're regulated or not, because without a compliance backbone, your information security program may suffer. Therefore, your organization may suffer overall breaches, incidents, all that fun stuff. But I think what we're going to start seeing is, again, move towards AI. Organizations maturing at incredible rates in this space. Organizations, there's a huge labor shortage right now. That's affecting the cybersecurity and GRC space, making AI and machine learning even more imperative, right? Because organizations don't have the resources to spend on these types of analytics or this type of monitoring activity or maintaining this type of program. And that's where I think we're going to see AI and machine learning starting to really take off. In addition to that, I think that these more complex organizations with these parent-child relationships are going to have to start maintaining their GRC programs, or we're going to see sort of an uptick in a need to maintain cybersecurity in this type of hierarchical model. With these parent-child relationships, parent companies, subsidiaries, parent companies of subsidiaries, whatever the case may be, it just gets ever more complex, which again is why I think AI and machine learning will be really imperative with these really complex environments.
Interesting. No, I think that I appreciate the conversation. I think we are all hopeful that the future are more people are more cyber aware, right? They're more GRC aware. That, as we've discussed and we've discussed with most people, is a huge reason why we're trying to continue to have this topic and we're having conversations around the topic, because in 2022, it's super important, and it's only going to continue to get more and more important as the supply chains are stretched thin, as we are trying to find more people as internal and external resources to continue to move the companies forward, as more companies become more and more remote and offer other abilities. And now we can just, remotely access all of these things. So I absolutely agree. I think that it's going to become more and more important. Now, Vlad, I'm going to typically ask your next question. So we like to ask, and Vlad has a love for career advice. He likes to play it off like he's trying to help other people, but some of us just really think that Vlad is looking for career advice for his own career. But Heather, so if you were talking to someone early or mid-career, maybe they're looking to get into cybersecurity, or maybe they're looking to get into GRC or to learn more, what would be your advice to them?
Always be open-minded and always take the risk. Always. Just say yes. I think I say that because in my career, again, I sound like a broken record, but my career was such a spaghetti bowl. And I learned what I didn't want to do, probably a lot more than what I, learned I wanted to do. But I have, it helped me advance in my career. I feel like I developed more of an arsenal for my career because I was in the habit of always saying yes. Yep, I'll go do that. Or, yep, I'll take that road and we'll see where it goes. And for especially someone young in their career or just starting in a new industry, you don't have anything to lose, right? There's always something you can fall back on. There's always a career move to make. So why not take the chance and take the risk and, be really open-minded to things that you might turn your nose up at. Just do it. Just give it a go.
I love that. So Vlad is going to have thoughts on that. But first, I want to make the comment that we're 3 episodes into the cybersecurity theme, and I think all 3 people have given eerily similar advice that include just
awesome.
say yes. I'm not sure if that's a thing of the guests that we've brought on. I don't know if that's a function of cybersecurity. I don't know if everyone listening should be deeply terrified. That's how all of the cybersecurity experts have gotten here. But what are your thoughts on the career advice?
No, I mean, I think it's definitely something to think about. I think, again, speaking for myself at least, the world of cybersecurity seemed very mysterious until we started having these conversations. And at
Mhm.
least, again, from an engineering standpoint, it was always very scary of what it could like impact our systems with, and not understanding the space and now having a little bit more of that knowledge makes total sense. How it's not necessarily a textbook approach, right? There's no predefined steps, so I think you have to be almost comfortable with ambiguity, and it's more of a,
Mhm.
I would say, again, it's not a blanket approach to any given situation. There's a lot more, I would say, kind of creativity and thinking than just, again, here are the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you need to achieve. So now that I've again spoken to a number of people on cybersecurity, I understand that it's not as scary as I initially thought.
I think that's probably why you heard the same advice. That's hilarious. I didn't realize I was giving advice that had already been given, but I think you're probably hearing something along that trend because we work in cyber and there are so many different silos within cyber,
Yes.
right? I work in cyber within the GRC niche,
Mhm.
whereas, other persons that you've interviewed or will interview may work solely in hardware and technical
Mhm.
controls, or, a totally different approach to cybersecurity. And I think, Vlad, you made a great point with, it's not a one size fits all model, but that's
Mhm.
also what makes this industry so exciting, because we're always solving new problems and having to provide unique solutions. Or, there are so many things that go into cybersecurity, right? When you talk about what's your infrastructure, how many vendors do you have? What kind of vendors are they? Like, there are all of these qualifying questions, and that's forced us to be more open-minded and ready for change and all of these things in our careers. Because I would be willing to bet that anyone you talk to this month and you've talked to previously have really similar spaghetti diagram type backgrounds that I do,
Right.
because there are just so many different directions and turns and things like that that you can take in this industry.
And I was gonna make that comment too. I guess, like, from an initial, again, perspective, it almost feels to some degree overwhelming because there's so many different
Hmm.
directions that you could pull into, right? And again, having maybe more of like a technical background, you'd be focused on, we want to
Mhm.
secure the system that we have like on the plant floor. We want to make sure our controllers are good, but it may kind of, I guess the word would be, cloud our vision to some degree because you're not seeing the entire picture of a business. So
Right.
it's like it could be overwhelming at times on where to focus if you don't maybe take a step back and look at everything that's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes,
Foundation is important.
and to that point, I think that cyber has grown exponentially within the last, 5 to 7 years. GRC has grown exponentially within the last 5 to 7 years, both in people and kind of scope, because there's been so much. And as we grow as an industry, as industries and as the world, we're going to need more and more. And there are different areas. And now we've had a couple of conversations in a row that talked about, excuse me, that talked about artificial intelligence, which I think is exceptionally, exciting. And maybe some of those very like low hanging fruit applications that manufacturing and industrial companies can pull in, because it's data that is generally similar, across all industries. So I absolutely agree. And to kind of your point, Heather, I think that it's very good advice. Like, many people have given the advice of just say yes. I think it's just amazing that we're 3 for 3 of cybersecurity folks who have given the same advice. So I appreciate that. So I like to joke that this next segment is the hashtag not sponsible audio or audible sponsorship. So Vlad and I first started the asking for book or other recommendation, and like 25 times in a row, Vlad said, "I'm going to go download that book now." So now we like to joke that it's the non-sponsored Audible recommendation. Do you have a book or a couple of book or other pieces of content information that you would suggest people take a look at?
I actually brought a couple of podcast recommendations,
Okay.
because if you're listening to this, then you like podcasts at least a little bit.
Yes.
So a couple of podcasts that I would recommend, and these are specific to more like the GRC side, the risk side of
Okay.
cybersecurity. One's called Risky Business, And no, I'm not talking about the film. It's risky.biz. And that's a really great one just to understand there's a diverse realm of topics within risk. If you're just trying to figure out, what does risk even mean? It's a really great podcast to go listen to. There's another one called the Compliance Podcast Network. And within this network, there are multiple different podcast series. I've actually been on this podcast, and the gentleman's name is Tom Fox. He's another great resource. And I've been on his podcast a couple of times, so I promise I'm not biased. It's a good podcast. And he explores things like ESG, basic compliance, how to build a compliance foundation, lots and lots of good topics, great speakers on there. So I'd recommend that resource as well, just for some cruising, listening, in the car, commuting.
So I believe I have had the Risky Business podcast recommended based upon my other podcast listening habits. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like I remember it because of the name, and I kind of had to do the double take on the name. So I don't know what that says about my podcast listening habits, but now everyone knows that has made it into the feed in the past. So Heather, but before we ask who should reach out, we kind of briefly touched on what you do with 6clicks on the GRC and your AI Haley. Can you give us kind of like the super or the kind of overview of what you do and Haley, what you guys are building, please?
Absolutely. So at 6clicks, we're a full suite GRC platform. And what I mean by that is we support multiple modules, multiple workflows within the GRC space, from policy management to incident management, compliance, vendor risk management in general, ERM, everything in between in our platform. And we offer a unique architecture in that we can enable organizations with that hierarchical structure of parent-child relationship to manage their GRC programs within the children autonomously of one another, but then roll up to the parent. So this is great for like private equity firms managing a client portfolio, or a holding company with multiple subsidiaries, or even a large enterprise with multiple regions that all need to operate autonomously of one another, but ultimately roll up to a corporate GRC posture. But Haley, our AI engine, enables organizations to complete one assessment and map those results onto another. So she does automatic crosswalking between standards, laws, regulations, frameworks, within cyber, within privacy, within FinServ, everything in between. And what that would really mean is, to give you like a practical example, if you came into our product and completed an ISO 27001 assessment, right? And then all of a sudden you have to become compliant with PCI DSS, which is a payment card industry payment processor regulation. Once you complete your ISO 27001 assessment, Haley will take those results, map those onto PCI using the BERT model, and show you your potential compliance to PCI based on that one assessment. So it's an assess once, apply to many type model using our AI engine. In addition to that, Haley also maps internal policy documents. So your bespoke policies, right? This is our acceptable use policy. This is our bring your own device policy, whatever it may be. You can upload those into the platform, and Haley will take those and map them onto your compliance requirements. So this is important for organizations that are getting audited, right? Against an ISO or against a PCI, for example, and need to show compliance to your internal policy programs to these regulations. And Haley does all of that automatically. And just to put it kind of into perspective, the kind of power we're talking about here. So as a consultant, I would literally, when I was fresh out of college, just getting my feet wet in consulting, when they give me all of the really fun work and all the really fun projects, right? I was literally hired at multiple client sites simply to do a crosswalk between regulations and frameworks, right? How does this control from regulation A map onto this control from regulation B, or these controls, or what have you? And once upon a time, I was at a really, really large retail organization in Seattle, and I was brought on to crosswalk 5 different regulations together. And that took me 240 hours worth of billable time And Haley can do that kind of work in less than 5 minutes. So that's the kind of like magnitude of savings that we're talking about with AI. And at 6 Clicks, we're a really AI forward organization. So this is just the beginning for Haley. Haley will be doing all of that predictive analytics later this year as kind of the Haley 3.0, if you will. But yeah, it's truly powerful what big data and a little bit of AI thrown in can do for an organization.
No, I think that's very exciting. I really appreciate the example because you kind of laid out everything that it could do, and I'm like, that is amazing. So I would imagine if you are listening to this and that is something your organization has to do, you immediately know who you are. So I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that. And then I guess last question for you, Heather, is who should reach out to you? Who do you want to connect with? Either kind of in conjunction with what you're doing with 6 Clicks, outside of 6 Clicks. Who do you want to connect? Who would you like to connect with? Who do you want to help? Who are you looking for help from?
So I would love to help any organization that has multiple compliance requirements, or even one. If you're regulated, we can help you. We also have a slew of partners that we work with that can help you from a consultancy perspective, but we can help you with our tool. We can help you streamline your processes. Anyone who's in an organization that has that hierarchical type of format or infrastructure within your organization, and you need to maintain multiple risk registers, contact us. If you don't know what I'm talking about and you want to know more about GRC, hit me up. I'm here to talk about it. I would love to talk about budding organizations that are just getting their feet wet in information security or cybersecurity. Those are all really exciting conversations for me to have. Who I would like to learn from is I really love talking to industries that I don't get to hear from very often, right? In my world, I get to talk to technology, government, financial services, fintech, all of these really highly regulated healthcare type of industries. And manufacturing, falls into place some, but I'm really, I'd be keen to understand what cybersecurity means to people sitting in industrial technology or manufacturing right now, right? I know what it means from my perspective and how we can help, and I'm curious to understand if this is something that manufacturing and industrial technology type industry folks care about. Is this something that they're thinking about? Is this in the plans? Is this just something that they hear about and they don't know what to do with it, right? I would love to learn more about what that journey looks like, because I think there's this gap that needs to be bridged between our industries and our expertise.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. And I would say, kind of to your point, I think the more regulated you are, so the pharmaceuticals, perhaps the automotive, certainly the aerospace, certainly the defense, they have the slew of regulations, right? And they have, cross compliances and all of those things. I would say when you get into more like the wild west, like the food and bev, everything from, a small mom and pop shop up to, your Fortune 50, that varies widely, right? I am sure I'm not sure. I would hope the Fortune 500, maybe the Fortune 5000, all have some good form of GRC kind of in place. But when you get below that, a lot of that is kind of Vlad is shaking his head no, but we won't dig into that, Vlad. But the kind of, once you get beyond that, the conversation comes of, what do people care about technology wise, and what does risk and everything like that look like, and maybe how cyber or how compliance forward we are as an organization. So I would say it probably varies significantly from organization to organization, which is a lot of what we've seen kind of around this general cybersecurity theme, and much of kind of the experience of everyone that I've talked to and we've talked to. But I think that those would be very good conversations. Again, we need to create more awareness around GRC, around cyber, around all of these best practices in manufacturing as a whole. So I appreciate that. And I thank you. Vlad, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think, on my side, I certainly have a lot of homework still to do. I think the world of cybersecurity, again, like it's I think it's easy to understand but very complex once you get into it. And so I'm
Yes.
just going to continue to read and have these conversations to learn more. But really
No.
appreciate your time and thank you for talking to us, Heather.
Oh, it's been
Yes.
such a pleasure. I appreciate you having me on.
No, no. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Before I ask everyone to like and subscribe, I'd like to throw a special shout out to Hank and I believe his nieces. A couple of his young nieces live with them, and they watch all of our shows, which is amazing.
Oh.
I think they are the two youngest viewers so far. So a special thank you, guys. Thank you, Hank, and your nieces. Thank you, guys, for that. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching and coming to spend some more time with us. If you have not, please do the thing like and subscribe. You can rate us on Apple Podcasts, which is what we changed the name to. You can do it on Spotify. You can apparently do it on Audible. If you're one of like the 3 people we have listening on Audible, I don't know if 3 people is enough to get an Audible rating, but we would certainly appreciate your rating. All of it helps. We've been growing astronomically month over month on the podcast side. So thank you to all of our listeners and all of our viewers. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone. We will see everyone live next week, Wednesday, and we'll catch you guys on the podcast on Thursday morning.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Heather.